Imagine you are a soldier. You haven't eaten in 3 days. Your boots have holes in them. The soles of your feet are bleeding onto the Virginia mud beneath you. Your uniform, once proud, once pressed, is now little more than rags hanging off a body that has forgotten what warmth feels like. You have watched your best friend die in a ditch beside a road you didn't even know the name of. You have written letters home that you were never sure would arrive. You have prayed, God, let this end. Let this end. Let this end. And now, on this cold April morning in 1865, you are marching again. You don't know where. You don't know why anymore. You just march, because marching is the only thing left that still makes sense. But somewhere ahead of you, somewhere in the fog of this exhausted, bleeding army, a general is sitting on a horse. And that general is carrying a weight that no human being should ever have to carry alone. His name is Robert E. Lee, and today he is about to make a decision that will end a war and break something inside him that will never fully heal again. This is not just a story about a surrender. This is a story about what it costs to finally admit that it's over. To understand what happened on April 9th, 1865, you have to understand what the 4 years before it looked like. The American Civil War had begun in the spring of 1861, a conflict born from decades of tension, compromise, and eventually collapse. At its heart was the question of slavery, a brutal institution that had been woven into the economic and social fabric of the southern states for generations. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president on a platform that threatened the expansion of that institution, 11 southern states made a decision that would cost hundreds of thousands of lives. They seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. What followed was not the quick, clean war that either side had imagined. It was 4 years of artillery fire and bayonet charges. 4 years of disease tearing through camps faster than bullets. 4 years of mothers receiving folded flags instead of sons. By the time 1865 arrived, the United States had lost more men in this single conflict than it would lose in both world wars combined. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Somewhere between 620,000 and 750,000 soldiers dead. And behind every number, a name. Behind every name, a family. Behind every family, a grief that never fully went away. By early 1865, the Confederacy was no longer the force it had been. Its resources were depleted, its population was exhausted, its supply lines were strangled. Cities that had once felt untouchable were now occupied or under siege. And yet, and this is the part that history sometimes forgets, the war was not over. Not yet. Because as long as Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia remained in the field, the Confederacy still had a heartbeat. Lee had become more than a general. He had become a symbol. In the South, people spoke his name the way they spoke of saints. He had won battles that no one thought he could win. He had outmaneuvered commanders far better supplied and far better supported than himself. He had held the line when the line had no right to hold. And because of that, his army had become the last real hope, the last beating pulse of a dying nation. But even symbols have limits, and by the spring of 1865, Robert E. Lee was running out of road. The beginning of the end can be traced to a city called Petersburg, Virginia. For 9 months, from June 1864 to April 1865, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had laid siege to Petersburg, a critical railroad hub just south of the Confederate capital of Richmond. Lee's army defended a network of trenches and fortifications that stretched for miles across the Virginia landscape. It was grinding, miserable work. Soldiers on both sides dug themselves into the earth and waited, and watched and died in small numbers every single day. Grant's strategy was not complicated. He didn't need to be clever. He had something Lee didn't have: men, supplies, industry, a nation behind him that was still producing, still growing, still feeding its army. All Grant had to do was hold on. All Grant had to do was squeeze. And slowly, month by month, the squeeze got tighter. Lee's army was starving. Desertion rates climbed. Men who had fought for years began slipping away in the night, not out of cowardice, but out of simple, desperate mathematics. Their families were hungry. Their farms were abandoned. The war had already taken everything, and now it was asking for more. In late March of 1865, Grant launched a series of coordinated attacks along the Confederate lines. On April 1st, Union forces shattered the Confederate right flank at a place called Five Forks. It was a decisive blow. The following day, Grant ordered a full assault along the entire line. Confederate defenses, stretched thin and manned by soldiers who were more shadow than soldier, began to collapse. Lee sent a message to Confederate President Jefferson Davis that has gone down in history for its stark, cold honesty. The situation is not tenable. Translation: it's over. Get out now. That night, Davis and his government fled Richmond. The Confederate capital, the city that had been the heart and the symbol of the Southern Rebellion, was abandoned. And as Union troops marched in the following morning, a city that had held on for 4 years finally fell silent. Lee had no choice but to run. What came next was not a retreat in the military textbook sense. It was a collapse in motion. Lee ordered his army westward, away from Richmond, away from the fallen lines, toward the interior of Virginia. The goal was the town of Amelia Courthouse, where supply trains were supposedly waiting. If the army could eat, if they could rest, restock, and breathe, they might still have options. They could push south and link up with General Joseph Johnston's Confederate Army in North Carolina. If those two forces combined, the war could continue. Maybe not forever, but long enough to negotiate something better than total defeat. It was a desperate plan, built on a foundation of desperate hope. The retreat began in darkness. Soldiers who had barely slept in days were now being asked to march. Through the night, through rain, through roads churned into mud by thousands of boots and wagon wheels. Men fell asleep while walking and had to be shaken awake by the soldier behind them. Officers who had commanded with confidence for years now moved with the hollow eyes of men who could no longer pretend. And behind them, around them, closing in from every direction, was Grant's army. Grant understood this moment completely. He had waited 9 months for it. He was not going to let Lee's army escape into the countryside, where it could scatter and reform and extend this war by months or years. He sent his cavalry racing ahead to intercept Confederate supply lines. He pushed his infantry along parallel roads, moving faster than Lee, cutting off routes before Lee could reach them. It became a race, and Lee was running on empty. When the army finally reached Amelia Courthouse, the supply trains were not there. The food was not there. Through some catastrophic miscommunication, the trains had been sent somewhere else. Lee's soldiers, who had marched for days on almost nothing, arrived at the one place they had been counting on and found nothing waiting for them. One day was lost foraging the surrounding countryside. One day that Lee could not afford to lose. That was when the weight of it truly began to settle. Because while Lee's men searched empty fields for something to eat, Grant's forces were closing the gap. Every hour that passed was an hour they could not get back. And when the army moved again, moving south and west through the Virginia countryside, it was not a retreat anymore. It was a pursuit. And Lee's men were the ones being chased. The days between April 5th and April 8th, 1865, were among the most punishing in the history of either army. Confederate soldiers marched until their legs stopped working, then marched some more. Men threw away their equipment, not because they gave up, but because their bodies simply couldn't carry it anymore. Generals who had prided themselves on the discipline of their commands watched that discipline dissolve, not from weakness of character, but from the pure, physical impossibility of holding it together any longer. There were still moments of fierce fighting. At Sailor's Creek on April 6th, Union forces caught up with a significant portion of Lee's army and inflicted a devastating defeat. Nearly 8,000 Confederate soldiers were captured in a single afternoon, roughly a quarter of what remained of Lee's entire force. When Lee rode to a hilltop and watched the survivors streaming back toward him in disorder, he reportedly said quietly, almost to himself, "My God, has the army dissolved?" It had not dissolved, not entirely, not yet, but it was dissolving, and everyone could see it. Grant, reading the situation with the clear eyes of a man who knew he had already won, sent Lee a message on April 7th. It was measured, respectful, and absolutely direct. Grant wrote that the results of the last week must convince Lee of the hopelessness of further resistance, and he asked Lee to surrender his army in order to avoid further bloodshed. Lee wrote back. He asked what terms Grant was offering. The exchange of letters continued over the following day, and while generals exchanged carefully worded messages, their soldiers kept moving, kept fighting, kept dying, because no one had told them to stop yet. On the night of April 8th, Lee held a council of war with his senior commanders. They met by firelight, in the cold, surrounded by what remained of an army that 4 years ago had marched with flags and music and the absolute certainty that they were going to win. Now they sat in the dark and talked about whether there was any way forward that didn't end in catastrophe. There was one option left, one last possibility. Union cavalry was blocking the road west at Appomattox courthouse. But cavalry, no matter how well positioned, is vulnerable to infantry. If Confederate forces could attack at dawn and break through that cavalry screen, the road might open, the army might escape, the retreat could continue. It was a thin hope, paper thin, but it was something. They decided to try. Before dawn on April 9th, Confederate troops formed up in the darkness and prepared to attack. There is something almost unbearable about this moment when you sit with it. These were men who had been marching for days without food, men who were hollow with exhaustion and grief, men who had already lost more than most human beings are ever asked to lose. And here they were, in the dark, fixing bayonets, preparing to charge one more time, because their general had asked them to, and because, even now, they weren't ready to let him down. The attack launched at first light. Confederate soldiers pushed forward with everything they had left, and for a brief, extraordinary moment, it seemed to work. The Union cavalry fell back. The road ahead began to clear. Officers who had been bracing for failure looked at each other with something that might have been hope, and then they looked beyond the cavalry. Behind the retreating horsemen, stretching across the road and into the fields on both sides, were Union infantry. Not a skirmish line, not a screening force, an army. Tens of thousands of men who had marched through the night and arrived while Lee's troops slept. They stood in lines so thick and so deep that the road ahead wasn't a road anymore. It was a wall. Confederate General John Gordon, commanding the assault, sent a message back to Lee. "Have fought my corps to a frazzle. I can do nothing unless Longstreet can help me." Longstreet was pinned down behind them by Union forces approaching from the east. There was no help coming. There was no road open. There was nowhere left to go. Robert E. Lee received Gordon's message and sat with it for a long moment. He was 60 years old. He had graduated second in his class from West Point without a single demerit, a record that still stood. He had served the United States Army for over 30 years before resigning his commission in 1861. When Abraham Lincoln had offered him command of the Union armies at the war's beginning, he had turned it down, not because he believed in slavery, not because he wanted this war, but because he could not raise his sword against Virginia, the state that was his home. That decision had cost him everything. His family estate, Arlington, had been seized by the Union government and would eventually become a national cemetery, its grounds filled with the graves of the men who had fought against him. His country had been divided, his cause had collapsed, and now his army, the thing he had poured the last 4 years of his life into, was dying around him in the Virginia mud. He sat on his horse, Traveler, and looked at the situation clearly. The army was surrounded. His men were exhausted, starving, and outgunned. Continuing the battle would mean sending those men to die for ground they could not hold, for a cause that was already lost, for a result that would change nothing except the number of graves that had to be dug before it was over. Lee reportedly said to one of his generals, "There is nothing left for me to do but go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Read that sentence again. I would rather die 1,000 deaths. This was not a man who wanted to surrender. This was a man choosing surrender because the alternative, letting his soldiers die for nothing, was something he could not live with. He had sent those men into battle for 4 years. He had asked everything of them. He was not going to ask them to die for his pride. He put on his finest dress uniform, his best sword. He was going to meet Grant looking like what he was, the commander of a beaten army who still carried himself with dignity. And he rode toward Appomattox courthouse. The house belonged to a man named Wilmer McLean. And if history has a sense of irony, McLean's story is proof of it. When the Civil War began in 1861, McLean had been living near Manassas, Virginia, and his farm had been used as a Confederate headquarters during the First Battle of Bull Run, one of the war's earliest major engagements. A Union artillery shell had actually come through his kitchen. Seeking to escape the conflict, McLean moved his family to a quiet, out-of-the-way place where he was sure the war would never find them. That place was Appomattox Courthouse. The war found him anyway, and now, on April 9th, 1865, history arrived on his doorstep and asked to use his parlor. Lee arrived first and waited. Grant arrived about an hour later, still wearing a mud-spattered field uniform, an almost accidental contrast to Lee's immaculate dress. Accounts describe the two men as almost startlingly different in appearance. Lee, tall and silver-haired, carrying himself with the formal dignity of a man who had spent his life in the old military tradition. Grant, shorter, plain, looking more like a man who had been fighting a war than commanding one. They had met before, once during the Mexican-American War, nearly 20 years earlier. Grant remembered Lee. Lee confessed he did not remember Grant, a detail that must have stung, though Grant never said so. They talked briefly about Mexico, about the weather, about anything, for a few strange minutes, except what they were there to discuss. And then they talked about surrender. Grant's terms were, by the standards of the time, remarkably generous. Confederate soldiers would stack their arms and their equipment. They would sign paroles, written promises not to take up arms against the United States again. And then they would be free to go home. Not to prison, not to punishment. Home. Lee asked about the horses. Many of his soldiers owned their horses personally. They had not been issued by the Confederate Army, but brought from farms and stables across the South. Could they keep them? Grant considered this for a moment. Technically, his terms did not allow it, but Grant understood something about the peace that would have to follow this war. He understood that those men would be going home to farms that hadn't been worked in years, to families that were already struggling to survive. A man without a horse couldn't plant a crop. A man who couldn't plant a crop would starve. And a nation full of starving, angry, defeated men was not a nation that could heal. Grant said yes, the men could keep their horses. Lee reportedly said, "This will have the best possible effect upon the men. It will be very gratifying and will do much toward conciliating our people." The terms were written. The papers were signed. And just like that, in a quiet parlor in a small Virginia village on a Sunday afternoon, the most devastating war in American history took its first real step toward ending. What happened after the papers were signed is, in some ways, just as important as the signing itself. Grant's officers began celebrating loudly. Artillery salutes, cheering, the sounds of men releasing 4 years of fear and tension in one explosive moment of relief. Grant immediately ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." There would be no victory parade past Lee's men, no humiliation, no public gloating. Grant understood that the harder, longer work of rebuilding a nation was about to begin, and it could not begin in a climate of humiliation and revenge. When Lee rode away from the McLean house, soldiers from both sides lined the road. Union troops who had fought Lee's army for years stood and watched him pass in silence. Some saluted, some removed their hats. Whatever they felt about the cause he had fought for, and many of them felt a great deal, they understood that they were watching something historic, something human, something that deserved a moment of quiet. Lee rode back to what remained of his army and delivered the news in a short written order, General Order No. 9, now known as his farewell address to his troops. He told them they had been compelled to yield to overwhelming numbers and resources. He told them that he had done for them what he could. He told them to go home, to be good citizens, to help rebuild. When the order was read aloud to groups of soldiers gathered in the fields around Appomattox, men who had not cried in years wept openly. Some grabbed hold of Lee's horse as he rode past, touching the animal's flank, as if trying to hold on to something they couldn't name. Men who had marched through fire and blood and hunger pressed close to their general one last time, just to be near him. Lee reportedly could not speak for long stretches. He kept turning his face away. Here is what the history books often simplify. The Civil War did not end at Appomattox. Not legally, not completely. Other Confederate armies were still in the field. General Joseph Johnston commanded a large force in North Carolina. General Edmund Kirby Smith still held Confederate forces west of the Mississippi River. There were skirmishes after Appomattox. There were soldiers who kept fighting for weeks after Lee surrendered because no one had told them to stop. The last land battle of the Civil War was fought in Texas on May 12th and 13th, more than a month after Appomattox. The last Confederate general to formally surrender was Stand Watie, a Cherokee leader commanding Native American Confederate forces, who laid down his arms on June 23, 1865, over 2 months after Lee. And then there is the question of what the war actually ended. Slavery was abolished. The 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865, but the world those freed people were entering was not yet prepared to receive them as equal citizens. The years of Reconstruction that followed were filled with new forms of oppression, with violence, with broken promises, with a country that was technically reunited, but deeply, painfully fractured. The men who had fought for the Confederacy went home to lives that had been shattered. The men who had fought for the Union went home to a country that was trying to figure out what it was supposed to become. And the formerly enslaved people, who had every reason to celebrate the war's end, found themselves standing in a freedom that came without land, without money, without legal protection, without any of the things that make freedom real rather than just a word. Appomattox was not an ending. It was a hinge, a place where one chapter of American history swung closed, and another, just as complicated, just as painful, just as important, swung open. April 9th, 1865 matters not because it ended everything cleanly. It didn't. It matters because of what happened in that parlor between two exhausted men who had been trying to destroy each other for 4 years. It matters because Grant offered mercy when he could have demanded punishment, and because that mercy, however imperfect, set a tone for what the peace might look like. It matters because Lee chose to protect his soldiers, even when it cost him everything he had fought for, and because that choice meant thousands of men who would have died in a hopeless final stand got to go home instead. It matters because somewhere in that story is a truth about human beings that we keep having to relearn, that the moment you stop fighting is not the moment of weakness. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, it is the bravest thing a person can do. The soldier with the bleeding feet and the hollow stomach who marched through the Virginia darkness on those April mornings, he got to go home. He got to see his family again. He got to hold whatever was left of his life in his hands and try to build something from it. Not because the cause he had fought for was right, it was not, but because two men in a quiet room in a small village found a way to stop. That is what happened at Appomattox Courthouse, and that is why, 160 years later, we are still talking about it.